The sickening crack of a steel pipe against human ribs echoes a lot louder than you'd ever think. When a local extortion crew left 19-year-old Tommy bleeding out in the dirt of a rusted scrapyard, they thought they owned the town. They forgot one crucial detail. Tommy was under the quiet, ironclad protection of the Hells Angels. Oak Haven, Pennsylvania, was a town that time and industry had left behind to rot. It was a place defined by shuttered mills, crumbling asphalt, and a relentless, suffocating summer heat that smelled perpetually of oxidized iron and cheap beer. At the edge of the county lines sat Halloway Iron and Salvage, a sprawling, chaotic graveyard of mangled chassis, stripped engines, and mountains of tires. For 19-year-old Tommy Gallagher, the scrapyard wasn't a graveyard, it was a sanctuary. Tommy was a kid who had been dealt a miserable hand by life, orphaned at 15 and entirely responsible for his younger sister, Lily. He didn't have the luxury of college or dreams of leaving Oak Haven. But what Tommy did have was an absolute, God-given genius for engines. His hands were permanently stained with heavy grease, his knuckles scarred from slipping wrenches. But if a motor had a heartbeat, Tommy could find it. He worked under Frank Halloway, a gruff 62-year-old Vietnam veteran who owned the yard. Frank had taken the kid in when no one else would, paying him under the table and teaching him the brutal economics of scrap metal and salvaged alternators. They were a family of circumstance, bonded by sweat and the rhythmic clanking of the yard's magnetic crane. But a scrap yard on the edge of county jurisdiction, hidden away from the prying eyes of the highway patrol, is a highly valuable piece of real estate for the wrong kind of people. Enter Declan Russo. Russo wasn't a mafia don or a criminal mastermind. He was a ruthless, opportunistic thug who ran a lucrative ring of chop shops across the tri-state area. Stolen cars from Philadelphia and Newark were brought down, stripped, and the serial numbers ground off before the parts were shipped overseas. Russo needed a new base of operations, a place big enough to hide 3 dozen stolen vehicles at a time. Halloway Iron and Salvage was perfect. For 3 months, Russo had been leaning on Frank to sell the yard for a fraction of its worth. There had been threatening phone calls, dead dogs thrown over the chain-link fence, and mysterious fires that conveniently burned out before reaching the main garage. But Frank was stubborn. He refused to bend. That pride culminated on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in late August. Tommy was underneath a wrecked 2018 Mustang, trying to salvage the catalytic converter, when he heard the crunch of heavy tires on the gravel. 4 black SUVs rolled through the front gates, fanning out like a tactical blockade. Dust plumed into the stagnant air as the doors opened. A dozen men stepped out. At the front was Declan Russo, wearing a sharp, out-of-place linen shirt, smiling a cold, predatory smile. Beside him was his primary enforcer, a hulking, 280-pound brute named Gareth Heston. Gareth carried a heavy, galvanized steel pipe, slapping it rhythmically against his calloused palm. Frank stepped out of the corrugated metal office, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He didn't flinch, but Tommy could see the old man's jaw tighten. "I told you on the phone, Declan," Frank said, his voice grating like an old brake pad. "The yard isn't for sale. Now get off my property before I call the sheriff." Russo chuckled, stepping over a puddle of stagnant oil. "The sheriff? Frank, you and I both know the sheriff is currently enjoying a very expensive fishing trip in Florida, courtesy of my associates. There is no law out here today. There's just you, me, and this piece of paper. Russo pulled a folded deed from his pocket. You're going to sign it. Go to hell, Frank spat. Gareth didn't wait for an order. The giant surged forward, grabbing the 62-year-old man by the collar of his coveralls and slamming him viciously against the side of a rusted tow truck. The impact knocked the wind out of Frank, who slumped to his knees, gasping. Tommy didn't think. The adrenaline spiked so fast it blurred his vision. He scrambled out from under the Mustang, a heavy 24-inch breaker bar gripped tightly in his right hand. "Hey, get your hands off him!" Tommy screamed, sprinting across the gravel. Russo sighed, looking at the teenager like one might look at a stray dog. "Take care of the kid. Make it hurt." Tommy swung the breaker bar with everything he had, aiming for Gareth's head. But he was a 19-year-old mechanic, not a street fighter. Gareth caught the bar with his forearm, grunted at the impact, and then smiled. He wrenched the tool out of Tommy's hands, tossing it aside. Then Gareth swung the steel pipe. The first blow caught Tommy in the stomach, doubling him over instantly as the oxygen violently evacuated his lungs. The second blow was a horrifying, indiscriminate swing to the side of Tommy's rib cage. Crack! The sound was nauseating. It echoed off the metal husks of the dead cars, sharp and final. Tommy hit the dirt, his vision exploding into a kaleidoscope of white-hot agony. He tried to breathe, but his chest felt like it had been crushed under a cinder block. Gareth wasn't done. He kicked Tommy in the jaw, snapping the kid's head back, then brought the heavy steel boots down on Tommy's leg. "Stop! Stop!" Frank screamed, crawling through the dirt, his face pale with terror. I'll sign the damn paper." Russo held up a hand, and Gareth paused, breathing heavily, the steel pipe dripping with a few drops of Tommy's blood from a gash on his side. Tommy lay curled in the fetal position in the oil-soaked dirt, coughing up a terrifying mix of saliva and crimson. "See, Frank, was that so hard?" Russo sneered, dropping the deed in the dirt next to the old man. "I'll be back on Friday with a notary. If the yard isn't cleared out, and if this deed isn't signed. Next time, Gareth puts the pipe through the kid's skull. Clean up your mess." The SUVs rolled out, leaving only the sound of Tommy's agonizing, bubbling breaths. The fluorescent lights of Oak Haven General Hospital flickered with an irritating buzz that made Frank Halloway feel like his head was splitting open. It was 2:00 a.m. on Wednesday. The smell of cheap bleach and stale coffee hung in the air. Down the hall, Tommy was hooked up to a terrifying array of monitors. He had 4 shattered ribs, a severely punctured left lung, a fractured orbital bone, and massive internal bruising. The doctors had needed to insert a chest tube just to keep him from drowning in his own blood. When Frank had seen the kid through the glass of the ICU, looking so small and frail amidst the tubes, a profound, crushing guilt had nearly dropped the old man to his knees. Sitting in the waiting room, Frank had tried to do things by the book. He had called the local police. Officer Mitchell, a jaded, lethargic cop who clearly had Russo's payroll money lining his pockets, had taken down the report with agonizing slowness. "Look, Mr. Halloway," Mitchell had mumbled, chewing a piece of stale gum. "Without security footage, and with you being the only witness, it's a he said, she said. Could be the kid just had an accident in the yard. Dropped a transmission on his chest. It happens." "He was beaten with a steel pipe by Gareth Heston," Frank roared, slamming his fist on the plastic table. Mitchell just shrugged, closing his notepad. "I'll file it, but don't expect a miracle." Frank knew they were entirely alone. By Friday, Russo would take the scrapyard. If Frank resisted, Tommy would be murdered. The system had failed them completely. Defeated, Frank picked up the plastic bag of Tommy's personal effects that the nurses had handed him. His bloodied mechanic coveralls, his steel-toed boots, and his scuffed leather jacket. As Frank folded the heavy leather jacket over his arm, something hard fell out of the inside breast pocket and clattered onto the linoleum floor. Frank bent down to pick it up. It was a heavy, solid brass challenge coin, emblazoned with a chilling insignia. A winged skull wearing a motorcycle helmet, bordered by the words, Hell's Angels, Rust Belt Charter. Wrapped tightly around the coin with a rubber band was a faded business card with a single name and a phone number scrawled in black Sharpie, Rick. Frank froze. The memory flooded back. 6 months ago, during one of the worst torrential downpours Oakhaven had seen in a decade, Frank had locked up the office and told Tommy to go home. But Tommy had stayed. A lone biker had limped his sputtering, smoking Harley-Davidson knucklehead into the yard. The man was soaked to the bone, a mountain of leather and denim, stranded on a pitch-black highway with a blown gasket. Most mechanics would have told the imposing, heavily tattooed biker to kick rocks until morning. Tommy didn't. For 4 straight hours, until 3 a.m., Tommy worked tirelessly in the freezing garage. He didn't have the right replacement part, so he meticulously fabricated a custom gasket out of high-temp silicone and scrap copper. He tuned the carburetor, tightened the loose belt, and got the legendary engine purring like a lion. When the giant biker reached into a thick wallet to pull out $500, Tommy had wiped his hands on a rag and shaken his head. "Keep it, man. A machine like that, and some sort, deserves respect, and bikers don't get left on the shoulder in the rain. Not on my watch." The man had stared at the 19-year-old kid for a long, silent moment. He put the money away, reached into his cut, and handed Tommy that coin and the card. "My name is Rick," the man had said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone. "I'm the president of the local charter. You ever find yourself in a hole you can't dig out of, you call that number. You tell them Big Rick owes you a favor." Sitting in the sterile hospital waiting room, looking at the blood-stained leather jacket of the boy he considered a son, Frank didn't hesitate. He pulled out his flip phone and dialed the number. It rang twice. A gruff voice answered. "Yeah, I need to speak to Rick," Frank said, his voice trembling slightly. "Who's asking who in the damn morning?" "My name is Frank Halloway. I'm calling on behalf of Tommy Gallagher, the kid who fixed the 47 knucklehead in the rain." There was a heavy pause on the line. The hostility instantly vanished, replaced by an ice-cold professional intensity. "Hold on." 30 seconds later, Rick's voice came on the line. "Frank, is the kid all right?" Frank broke down. The stoic veteran couldn't hold it in anymore. He told Rick everything. He told him about Declan Russo, the extortion, the corrupt cops, and the sickening crack of the steel pipe against Tommy's ribs. He told about the chest tube, the punctured lung, and the deadline on Friday. Rick listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't sigh. He just absorbed the information like a general receiving a battlefield report. When Frank finished, the silence on the phone was deafening. "Where is Russo right now?" Rick asked softly. The tone of his voice sent a shiver down Frank's spine. It wasn't the sound of a man getting angry. It was the sound of a man who had just decided to go to war. He and his boys are at my scrapyard, Frank stammered. They took it over tonight to celebrate. They're waiting for me to bring the deed. Stay with the kid, Frank, Rick said, his voice eerily calm. Don't leave that hospital. Don't call the cops again. We're going to take care of the paperwork. The line went dead. Out at Holloway Iron and Salvage, Declan Russo was in a celebratory mood. He had dragged a rusted burn barrel into the center of the yard, lit a fire, and was drinking imported beers with Gareth and 10 of his hardest thugs. They had the gates chained shut from the inside, blasting music from the open doors of an SUV, entirely confident that they were the undisputed kings of Oakhaven. By next week, we'll have 20 stolen luxury cars rolling through these gates, Russo laughed, clinking his beer bottle against Gareth's. And the old man is probably crying in a hospital waiting room right now. Easy money, boys. Easy money. Gareth grunted in agreement, tossing an empty bottle into the dirt. But at 3:15 a.m., the music from the SUV suddenly seemed to fade. It wasn't that the radio had broken, it was that another sound was rising in the distance. It started as a low, vibrating hum, something you felt in the soles of your boots before you actually heard it with your ears. The ground itself seemed to tremble. Gareth stopped laughing. He turned his heavy head toward the darkness outside the scrapyard's corrugated steel fencing. You hear that, boss? Russo frowned, squinting into the pitch-black night. The sound was growing louder. Much louder. It wasn't the sound of an 18-wheeler on the highway. It was a guttural, throbbing roar, a mechanical symphony of immense, terrifying power. Then the headlights appeared. They didn't come down the main road in a neat line. They swarmed out of the backwoods trails, the abandoned industrial access roads, and the highway, converging on the scrapyard from every conceivable direction. Dozens and dozens of blindingly bright headlights pierced through the chain-link fence, casting long, nightmarish shadows across the wrecked cars. The roar became deafening, an apocalyptic thunder that drowned out every other noise in the world. Russo dropped his beer bottle. It shattered on the gravel, but he couldn't even hear the glass. 100 heavily modified Harley-Davidson motorcycles had just completely surrounded Holloway Iron and Salvage. The riders killed their engines simultaneously, plunging the yard into a sudden, suffocating silence that was far more terrifying than the noise. Through the glare of the idling headlights, Russo saw the figures dismount. They were massive men, wearing heavily patched leather cuts. On their backs, illuminated by the halogen beams, was the iconic Death's Head insignia. Big Rick Stanton stepped up to the chained front gate, holding a pair of heavy bolt cutters. He didn't say a word. He just snapped the master lock with a loud crack, kicked the iron gates wide open, and walked into the yard, followed by a sea of leather, chains, and pure, concentrated fury. The trap was sealed, and there was no way out. The oppressive heat of the Pennsylvania night suddenly felt freezing cold to Declan Russo. He stood frozen by the burn barrel, the flames casting erratic shadows across the faces of the 100 men pouring into the scrapyard. They didn't rush, they didn't yell. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized discipline, fanning out to block every conceivable exit. The perimeter was entirely sealed by a wall of leather, denim, and heavily tattooed muscle. Russo's 12 thugs, who had been laughing and drinking just a minute prior, now scrambled backward, their bravado evaporating into the humid air. Several of them dropped their steel pipes and crowbars into the dirt, instinctively raising their hands. Big Rick Stanton walked deliberately through the center of the yard, the gravel crunching beneath his heavy engineer boots. He was a mountain of a man, his face scarred and weathered by decades of hard highway miles, his eyes dead and unblinking. Behind him walked his sergeant-at-arms, a massive bearded man named Cole, who carried a heavy steel wrench. Russo tried to swallow the lump of pure terror in his throat. He puffed out his chest, attempting to salvage a shred of authority. "Look, guys," Russo stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know what kind of misunderstanding we have here. This is private property. We're doing business." Rick stopped 10 feet away. He looked around the yard, his eyes scanning the crushed cars, the rusted crane, and finally settling on the puddle of Tommy's blood, still staining the dirt near the 2018 Mustang. "Business," Rick echoed, his gravelly voice slicing through the silence. "You came into an old man's yard. You beat a 19-year-old kid half to death with a pipe. A kid who went out of his way to help a brother of mine when he didn't have to." Rick locked eyes with Russo. "That ain't business. That's a mistake." Gareth Heston, the 280-pound enforcer who had nearly killed Tommy, hadn't completely grasped the reality of the situation. Fueled by adrenaline and ego, Gareth gripped the galvanized steel pipe, the exact same pipe he had used to shatter Tommy's ribs, and stepped in front of Russo. "You old bikers think you can just roll in here?" Gareth snarled, slapping the pipe against his palm. "Get back on your tricycles and ride out before we start breaking skulls." Rick didn't even look at Gareth. He just nodded to Cole. Gareth lunged, swinging the steel pipe in a brutal arc aimed at Cole's head. But the Angels had spent decades surviving bar brawls and highway wars. Cole stepped inside the arc of the swing, trapping Gareth's arm, and delivered a devastating headbutt squarely to the bridge of Gareth's nose. The cartilage shattered with a sickening crunch. As Gareth staggered backward, blind and bleeding, 3 more Angels stepped out of the shadows. It was over in less than 10 seconds. There was no chaotic brawl, just an overwhelming, surgical application of force. Gareth hit the dirt, the steel pipe stripped from his hands. He was dragged by his boots toward the back of the yard, out of sight. The muffled sounds of him weeping in the darkness sent a profound shudder through the rest of Russo's crew. "Anybody else want to defend this piece of real estate?" Rick asked, scanning the remaining thugs. They all dropped to their knees, interlacing their fingers behind their heads. Rick walked up to Russo, who was now trembling violently, the color entirely drained from his face. Rick reached into his leather cut, pulled out the deed that Russo had forced Frank to sign, and held it over the burn barrel until the flames licked the edges. He dropped the burning paper into the fire, watching it turn to ash. "Here is how your business operates now, Declan," Rick said quietly, stepping so close that Russo could smell the engine oil and tobacco on his leather. "You are going to walk to that office. You are going to sign over the titles to all 4 of your luxury SUVs to Frank Halloway. Consider it a down payment for the kids' medical bills." You can't do that," Russo whispered, terrified. "Those cars are worth $150,000. Rick smiled, and it was the most horrifying thing Russo had ever seen. "I'm not negotiating with you, Declan. I'm telling you the price of your life." Russo nodded frantically. He practically sprinted to the office, signing the titles with a violently shaking hand, transferring ownership of the black SUVs directly to the scrapyard. But Rick wasn't finished. "Now," Rick said, motioning toward the massive hydraulic car compactor sitting at the edge of the yard. "Load 'em up." Russo stared in disbelief. "What? But I just gave them to Frank." "Frank runs a scrapyard, Declan." Rick replied coldly. "He deals in scrap metal. Fire up the crusher." Under the watchful, heavily armed gaze of 100 Hell's Angels, Russo's thugs were forced to drive their own pristine $70,000 SUVs onto the loading ramp of the industrial compactor. The hydraulic press whined with deafening power. Russo watched, tears of absolute humiliation and rage welling in his eyes as the heavy steel jaws clamped down on the roof of his lead vehicle, shattering the custom glass and folding the reinforced chassis like a cheap tin can. One by one, the 4 vehicles were flattened into neat, rectangular blocks of twisted metal and shattered dreams. "Now," Rick said, pointing toward the dark, lonely stretch of highway leading out of Oakhaven. "Start walking. If I ever see you or any of your boys in this county again, we won't crush the cars next time." Russo and his 11 thugs, stripped of their weapons, their vehicles, and their pride, began the long, humiliating 12-mile walk back to civilization in the dead of night. 2 days later, Officer Mitchell was sitting in his patrol cruiser, chewing on a stale donut and counting the hush money in his glove box, when a call came over the radio about a group of battered, exhausted men walking along Route 9. When Mitchell rolled up and saw Declan Russo, covered in dust and nursing a bruised jaw, the cop practically leaped out of the car. "Declan, what the hell happened to you?" Mitchell asked, panicked. Russo just stared through the windshield of the cruiser, his eyes hollow. He didn't mention the car. He didn't mention the scrapyard. "Keep driving, Mitchell," Russo muttered, his voice devoid of life. "Just keep driving." Russo was never seen in Oakhaven again. The extortion ring vanished overnight. The chop shops dismantled in a panic. The ghost of the Hells Angels had effectively sanitized the town of its worst parasite. Meanwhile, inside Oakhaven General Hospital, the hum of the fluorescent lights felt a little less oppressive. Tommy Gallagher opened his eyes. His chest was heavily bandaged, and drawing a breath felt like swallowing razor blades. But he was alive. Frank was sitting in the chair next to the bed, asleep, his chin resting on his chest. "Frank?" Tommy croaked, his throat dry. The old man jerked awake, wiping his eyes. When he saw Tommy looking at him, a massive smile broke across his weathered face. "Tommy, you tough son of a gun." "The yard," Tommy whispered, panic flaring in his eyes as the memories of the steel pipe rushed back. "Russo. Friday." Frank gently placed a hand on Tommy's arm, laughing softly. "Don't you worry about Russo, kid. Russo decided to donate some scrap metal to the yard, and then he left town. Permanently." Tommy frowned in confusion. "How?" Frank reached into his pocket and placed the heavy brass challenge coin on the bedside table. It gleamed under the hospital lights. Hell's Angels, Rust Belt Charter. "Turns out," Frank smiled, tears welling in his eyes, "good karma pays out when you least expect it." 6 weeks later, autumn had begun to cool the sweltering Pennsylvania air. The leaves bordering Halloway Iron and Salvage were turning brittle and brown. Tommy was back in the yard, moving a little slower than usual, a thick brace wrapped around his ribs. He was underneath a salvaged pickup truck, turning a wrench with careful, measured movements. The familiar rumble of heavy engines echoed down the gravel road. Tommy slid out from under the truck. Frank stepped out of the office. Rolling through the front gates weren't 4 black SUVs. It was Rick Stanton, Cole, and 20 members of the charter. They weren't there for war this time. Cole had a massive cooler strapped to the back of his trike, filled with steaks and cold beers. Rick parked his '47 Knucklehead, the very same bike Tommy had fixed in the rain, kicked down the stand, and walked over to the young mechanic. Rick looked at Tommy's bandaged ribs, then extended a massive, calloused hand. "Heard you took a bad hit, kid," Rick said. Tommy took the biker's hand, gripping it firmly. "I've had worse. Just glad the yard is still standing." Rick smiled, clapping a heavy hand on Tommy's shoulder. "As long as we're drawing breath, nobody touches this yard again. You've got 100 brothers now, Tommy. You ever need an alternator swapped or a skull cracked, you know who to call." They fired up the grill that afternoon, using the crushed cubes of Russo's SUVs as makeshift tables for the beers. The sound of laughter and classic rock replaced the echoes of violence that had haunted the yard. Tommy Gallagher, an orphaned mechanic with nothing but a gift for engines and a good heart, had found the strongest family a man could ask for. And in Oakhaven, the legend of the night, the scrapyard was sealed, became a whispered warning to every thug who thought they were untouchable. Never mistake kindness for weakness, because you never know who is watching. If you loved this incredible true story of karma, loyalty, and street justice, please hit that like button right now. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a legendary comeback, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life stories where the good guys actually win. Leave a comment below telling us what you would have done in Tommy's shoes, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you in the next video. Blood, brotherhood, and a secret that could get her killed. She thought she'd escaped the outlaw life, falling for a rugged biker who promised her safety. But when he took off his shirt in the dim motel light, the ink on his skin proved she was sleeping with the very nightmare she ran from. The Nevada sun didn't just beat down on the town of Tonopah. It baked it into a state of permanent exhaustion. The heat radiating off Highway 95 was visible in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon and making the distant mountains look like a mirage. Inside the Rusty Spur diner, the swamp cooler rattled aggressively, doing little more than pushing around the scent of old grease, stale coffee, and bleached countertops. For 26-year-old Abby Lawson, the oppressive heat was a comfort. It kept people irritable, tired, and moving fast. More importantly, it kept them from looking too closely at the waitress refilling their mugs. Abby had been a ghost for 9 years. She didn't exist on social media, she didn't have a credit card, and she certainly didn't use her real name. The birth certificate, hidden in the lining of her cheap duffel bag back at her trailer, read Abigail Trenton. But Abigail Trenton had died the night her father, Arthur Grit Trenton, a notorious enforcer for the Hells Angels motorcycle club, was dragged out of their California home in handcuffs. He went down for a brutal string of federal racketeering charges and a high-profile murder tied to a turf war. Abigail had been the state's star witness, though her identity was fiercely protected. She was the one who handed the DEA the ledgers. She was the one who betrayed the club. In the outlaw world, rats don't get second chances. They get shallow graves in the Mojave. So she became Abby Lawson, a quiet, unassuming girl with dyed black hair, cheap thrift store clothes, and a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. She poured coffee, saved her tips, and kept her head down. Until the afternoon, Wyatt walked in. Abby heard him before she saw him. The guttural, thunderous roar of a Harley-Davidson knucklehead engine shook the diner's plate-glass windows. It was a sound that instantly made Abby's stomach drop. To a civilian, it was just a loud motorcycle. To Abby, it was the sound of her childhood. It was the sound of terrifying men gathering in her living room, of cigarette smoke, blood-stained leather, and whispered threats. She froze mid-pour, the diner's cheap glass coffee pot trembling in her hand. She watched the front door swing open. Her was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a predatory grace that immediately commanded the room. He wore heavy denim, scuffed engineer boots, and a sun-faded black leather vest. And there it was, stitched proudly onto the back of the leather. The winged death's head. The iconic red and white patches. The top rocker read Hell's Angels. The bottom rocker read Oakland. The motherland. The 1%er diamond patch sat squarely on his chest, a brazen declaration that he lived entirely outside the laws of polite society. Panic seized Abby's throat. Did they find me? Did my father send him? She instinctively took a step back toward the kitchen doors, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But the biker didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even look around, with the scrutinizing gaze of a hitman. He just looked exhausted. He ran a grease-stained hand through messy, sweat-dampened, sandy blonde hair, took off his dark sunglasses, and slumped into a corner booth. "Hey, Leah," the fry cook called out from the back, using her fake name. "Table 4 needs a menu." Abby swallowed hard. Her hands were shaking as she grabbed a plastic-coated menu. Act normal. Be a ghost. He doesn't know you. You were a teenager when you left. She walked over to the booth, keeping her eyes focused firmly on the scarred Formica table. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice tight but steady. The biker looked up at her. His eyes were a startling, piercing steel blue. They were hard eyes, eyes that had seen violence. But right now, they were just weary. "Black," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "And whatever pie is fresh. If none of it's fresh, just the coffee." "Cherries from this morning," she lied smoothly. "Cherry it is." When she returned with the mug and the pie, she noticed his hands. His knuckles were heavily tattooed, but they were also busted and bruised. There was a thin, fresh cut along his jawline. He caught her looking. "Blown head gasket," he said, offering a faint, crooked smile. "And a disagreement with a crowbar in Bakersfield. Bike's at the local shop down the street. Mechanic says it'll take a week to get the parts out here." Abby didn't ask which part of that explanation caused the bruised knuckles. She didn't want to know. "A week in Tonopah is a long time," she murmured, immediately regretting engaging him in conversation. "I've got nowhere to be," he replied, taking a slow sip of the scalding coffee. "I'm Wyatt." "Leah," she lied, the name slipping out easily. Over the next 7 days, Wyatt became a fixture at the Rusty Spur. He came in every afternoon, always sitting in the same corner booth, always ordering black coffee and whatever pie she recommended. Despite every survival instinct screaming at Abby to quit her job, pack her duffel bag, and catch a greyhound to Canada, she found herself staying. Wyatt was a contradiction. He wore the patch of a ruthless syndicate, a club her father had killed for. Yet he was quiet, observant, and strangely polite to her. He didn't catcall her like the rig workers did. He didn't leave cheap tips. He left crisp $20 bills and engaged her in quiet conversations when the diner emptied out. He told her he was taking a breather from the Bay Area, running the desert highways just to clear his head. She told him she was from a foster home in Oregon, just drifting through Nevada until she saved enough money to open a bakery. They were two drifters exchanging carefully constructed fictions, but the underlying loneliness in both of them was raw and real. Abby knew she was playing with fire. The Hells Angels weren't just a club, they were an intelligence network. If Wyatt happened to mention a girl named Leah with dark hair and a scar on her chin to the wrong brother, the puzzle pieces could connect back to Arthur Trenton's missing rat of a daughter. But loneliness is a powerful drug. For 9 years, Abby had denied herself any real human connection. She had no friends, no lovers, no confidants. When Wyatt looked at her with those steel blue eyes, it felt like the first time she had truly been seen in a decade. On the 8th day, the mechanic finished Wyatt's knucklehead. Wyatt came into the diner right before her shift ended. The engine rumbled ominously in the parking lot. "I'm heading south tomorrow morning," Wyatt said, leaning against the counter. He didn't look at her with his usual relaxed demeanor. There was an intensity there now. "Come for a ride with me tonight, Leah. Let me show you the desert. Desert when it's not trying to cook you alive." Every alarm bell in her brain rang in unison. "No. Step away. Run." "Okay," she whispered. The ride into the Nevada desert was intoxicating. Sitting behind Wyatt on the heavy, vibrating machine, her arms wrapped tightly around his leather vest, Abby felt a dangerous wave of nostalgia. The smell of hot engine oil, the wind roaring in her ears, the sheer, unapologetic power of the bike. It was a sensory overload that bypassed her fear and hit straight at her adrenaline. Wyatt drove them 40 miles out of town, pulling off the highway onto a desolate, hard-packed dirt ridge that overlooked a vast, sweeping valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of bruised purple, blood red, and burnt orange. They sat on a boulder, passing a lukewarm beer between them, watching the stars begin to pierce the darkening sky. "You don't talk much about your family," Wyatt noted casually, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Abby's grip on the glass bottle tightened. "Not much to talk about. The system raised me. I learned early on that relying on blood is a good way to get disappointed." Wyatt turned his head, looking at her intently. "I get that. Where I come from, the family you choose is the only one that matters. Blood is just an accident of birth. Brotherhood is a choice." "Does your brotherhood demand a lot?" she asked, immediately biting her tongue. She knew exactly what they demanded. Absolute, unwavering, terrifying loyalty. Wyatt smirked, a dangerous, thrilling expression. "It demands everything, but it gives back exactly what you put into it. Protection, respect, a purpose." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I know you're running from something, Leah. I can see it in how you watch the door at the diner, how you flinch when a siren goes off down the highway." Abby's breath hitched. "I'm not running." Wyatt reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. "It's okay if you are. Out here, everyone is running from something. But you don't have to run from me." He kissed her then. It wasn't the gentle, hesitant kiss of a boy. It was demanding, consuming, and pulled at a dark, broken part of her soul that she had tried to bury. She kissed him back fiercely, desperately, letting the lie consume her completely. For just one night, she didn't want to be the rat. She didn't want to be Arthur Trenton's daughter. She just wanted to be a girl in the desert with a beautiful, dangerous man. They didn't go back to her rusty trailer. They went to Wyatt's room at the infamous Clown Motel in Tonopah. The neon sign buzzed erratically outside the window, casting a sick, intermittent red glow into the cheap, wood-paneled room. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke, cheap aftershave, and ozone. The heat between them was frantic. The lies they had told each other didn't matter in the dark. As they fell onto the lumpy mattress, Abby's hands roamed over Wyatt's shoulders, feeling the thick, raised scars and the smooth texture of heavy tattoo ink beneath his skin. She knew the standard club tattoos. As Wyatt pulled his t-shirt over his head and tossed it aside, she saw the AFFA inked over his heart. She saw the number 81 on his bicep, the 8th and 1st letters of the alphabet, HA. She saw the smaller death's head on his forearm. She feigned ignorance, touching them lightly, playing the part of the naive civilian girl mesmerized by the bad boy. Wyatt was gentle, his rough hands surprisingly tender as they traced the curve of her waist. For an hour, in the suffocating heat of the desert motel, Abby felt genuinely safe. It was a stupid, reckless illusion, but she clung to it. Afterward, Wyatt rolled over and swung his legs off the bed. "I need a smoke," he muttered, his voice raspy. Abby lay back against the pillows, the sheets pulled up to her chest, watching his back as he reached for the pack of Marlboros on the cheap laminate nightstand. The neon light outside flickered, casting a sharp, red illumination across his broad, muscular back. And that was when her heart stopped beating. Abby froze. The air in her lungs turned to ice. She forgot how to breathe. There, covering Wyatt's right shoulder blade, was a massive, intricately detailed custom tattoo. It was mostly hidden when he wore his cut, but here, bare-chested, it dominated his skin. It was a grinning skull, wearing a shattered, spiked crown. Clutched in the skull's skeletal teeth was a bloody ace of spades. Wrapped around the base of the skull was a heavy iron chain, meticulously drawn with exactly 5 broken links. Beneath it, a Gothic script banner read, "San Gabriel, 08, no forgiveness." Abby stared at it, her vision blurring, a high-pitched ringing echoing in her ears. She knew that tattoo. She knew every single line of it, every shadow, every drop of ink. She had seen it being drawn on a piece of grease-stained napkin on her kitchen table when she was 15 years old. Her father, Arthur Grit Trenton, had designed it himself. It wasn't an official club patch. It was a blood-packed tattoo. A private, highly restricted piece of ink worn by only 5 men. In 2008, the Oakland and San Bernardino chapters had gone to war with the Mongols Motorcycle Club over a drug territory dispute in the San Gabriel Valley. It was a bloodbath. Dozens of men died. Arthur Trenton and his 4 most trusted enforcers had been trapped in a warehouse for 3 days, fighting off wave after wave of rival members. When they finally walked out alive, Arthur declared that the 5 of them were bound by something thicker than blood. He designed the shattered crown tattoo. Only those 5 men were allowed to wear it. Anyone else caught with it would have it removed with a blowtorch. Wyatt was in his early 30s. In 2008, he would have been a teenager, nowhere near a fully patched member, let alone part of Arthur Trenton's elite hit squad. There was only one way Wyatt had that tattoo. He didn't earn it in 1999. He inherited it. He was a legacy. He was connected directly to one of the 5 men her father trusted most. Maybe he was the son of one of them. Or maybe he was Arthur's new protégé, groomed inside the prison walls. Wyatt struck a match, the sulfur scent filling the room as he lit his cigarette. He inhaled deeply, the cherry glowing bright red, before exhaling a thick plume of smoke toward the ceiling. He didn't turn around. "You're quiet," Wyatt noted softly. Abby's mouth was bone dry. She tried to swallow, but her throat refused to work. She slowly pulled the motel sheet tighter around her trembling body, measuring the distance to the door, calculating if she had enough time to grab her jeans and run before he could cross the room. "I was just looking at your tattoos," Abby managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. She forced herself to sound casually curious, masking the sheer, unadulterated terror threatening to rip her apart. "The one on your back. The skull with the crown. I've never seen one like that before." Wyatt paused. The hand holding the cigarette hovered in the air. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head to look at her over his shoulder. The neon light caught his steel blue eyes, and the warmth that had been there 10 minutes ago was completely gone. They were flat, cold, and predatory. He turned his body fully toward her, sitting on the edge of the bed. He took another drag of the cigarette, the smoke curling around his face like a shroud. "You like it?" he asked. The gravel in his voice had hardened into stone. "It's intense," she stammers, fighting the urge to scramble backward against the headboard. "What does the crown mean? And the date?" Wyatt leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, staring directly into her soul. "It means someone tried to take down a king, and we're still hunting the rat who sold him out." Abby's blood ran completely cold. "The thing about rats," Wyatt continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft whisper, "is that they think they can hide. They change their names. They dye their hair. They run off to the desert and pour coffee, thinking the club has a short memory." He flicked ash onto the carpet, his eyes never leaving hers. "But the club never forgets, and neither does grit." He knew. "I didn't stumble into the Rusty Spur diner by accident. The blown head gasket, the quiet conversations, the gentle touches. It was all a trap. Wyatt had tracked her down. The Hells Angels had finally found Abigail Trenton. Wyatt reached over to the nightstand, his hand sliding past his pack of cigarettes to the heavy metal object resting in the shadows. When he brought his hand back, the neon light glinted off the barrel of a customized 1911 pistol. "Hello, Abigail," he whispered. The heavy steel of the 1911 pistol gleamed under the erratic red flash of the motel's neon sign. Abby stared down the barrel, her mind completely blanking, stripped of every lie she had carefully constructed for the last 9 years. The ghost of Abigail Trenton had finally been dragged back into the land of the living, and it was going to get her killed. She didn't scream. Screaming in a place like the Clown Motel in Tonopah only annoyed the neighbors. Instead, her survival instincts kicked in. Her hand gripped the edge of the cheap mattress, her muscles coiling as she calculated the distance to the bathroom door. "Don't do it, Abby," Wyatt warned, reading her body language instantly. His voice was dead calm, devoid of the passion they had shared just moments before. "You won't make it to the tiles. Sit still." Abby pulled the thin sheet up to her collarbone, her chest heaving. "Are you going to shoot me right here? Make a mess for the maid?" Wyatt slowly lowered the gun, though he didn't uncock it. He rested the heavy barrel against his thigh, the red cherry of his cigarette burning down toward his knuckles. If I wanted to put a bullet in your head, I would have done it on that ridge 2 hours ago. It would have been easier to bury you in the desert. Nobody digs in the Mojave. Then what do you want? She spat, the terror morphing into a desperate, cornered anger. Did my father send you? Did Grit finally decide the witness protection program wasn't good enough? Wyatt let out a dark, humorless chuckle. Your old man is rotting in ADX Florence, Abby. He's got 23 hours a day in a concrete box. He's not pulling strings anymore. Wyatt took a final drag of his cigarette and crushed it into the cheap glass ashtray. My name is Wyatt Sullivan. My father was Declan Sullivan. The name hit Abby like a physical blow. Declan Sullivan. He was one of the 5. He was the youngest of Grit Trenton's inner circle, a fierce loyalist who had practically lived on their living room couch when Abby was a teenager. Declan was arrested 3 days after you handed those ledgers to the DEA, Wyatt continued, his steel blue eyes locking onto hers, burning with a cold fire. He got 50 years in San Quentin, but he didn't even make it 3. A prison riot, a shank to the kidneys. He bled out on the rec yard floor. Abby squeezed her eyes shut, a tear hot and sharp escaping down her cheek. I didn't want him to die. I wanted out. I wanted it all to stop. The violence, the feds sitting outside my high school. My dad rode with Sonny back in the golden days of the Oakland Charter. Wyatt. He was untouchable, and he thought he was a god. But he was just a murderer. I had to stop him. Wyatt's jaw tightened at the mention of the legendary club founder. Barger's shadow still loomed large over the Angels, setting the gold standard for brotherhood and brutality. I know what your father was, Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. But here's the problem, Abby. The DEA didn't just use your testimony to lock up Grit. The feds doctored those ledgers. They used your signature to frame my father for a heroin trafficking ring he wasn't part of. Declan was an enforcer, sure, but he drew the line at smack. The feds needed a clean sweep, so they forged the documents you authenticated. Abby opened her eyes, staring at him in shock. No. Agent Jenkins promised me. Agent Jenkins is a dirty suit who used a scared 15-year-old girl to fast-track his promotion, Wyatt snarled. And now, the Oakland Charter thinks my father was dealing behind the club's back. They stripped his patches post-mortem. They disgraced his name. My family has been treated like rat blood for a decade. Wyatt leaned forward, the gun now fully lowered. I spent 5 years tracking you down, Abby. I hacked DMV records. I paid off rogue federal clerks, and I traced a single facial recognition ping from a traffic camera in Reno 6 months ago. I didn't come to kill the rat. I came to clear my father's name. I need you to testify again. I need you to go on the record and admit Jenkins fed you forged pages. Are you insane? Abby hissed, dropping the sheet slightly in her outrage. If I resurface, the club will slaughter me. Oakland doesn't care about a corrupted DEA file. They care that I put their top enforcer in a supermax. You owe me a life, Wyatt roared, the sudden volume making Abby flinch. He instantly caught himself, gripping the bridge of his nose, his knuckles turning white. You owe me, Abby. You took my father. Now you're going to help me get his legacy back. Before Abby could respond, the unmistakable crunch of gravel outside the motel room window shattered the tense silence. Wyatt froze. The predatory instincts returned in a split second. He smoothly raised the 1911, clicking the safety off. "Get on the floor," he ordered, his voice a lethal hiss. "What?" "Floor, now!" Abby threw herself off the mattress, hitting the stained carpet just as the cheap plywood door exploded inward. Splinters rained over the bed like shrapnel. 2 men rushed the doorway, clad in dark Kevlar vests and tactical masks. The metallic crack of a suppressed weapon hissed through the room, and the motel's television shattered into a shower of sparks and black glass. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He fired blindly through the darkness, the massive boom of his .45 caliber 1911 deafening in the tight space. The first intruder caught a round in the shoulder, spinning backward into the neon-lit parking lot with a choked grunt. "Oakland sent a cleanup crew," Wyatt yelled over the ringing in Abby's ears. "They must have followed my digital trail to Reno. They know you're alive." He fired twice more, suppressing the second gunman who tried to pie the corner of the door frame. Plaster dust choked the dry air. "Boots, move!" Wyatt barked. Abby scrambled on her hands and knees, grabbing her faded denim jacket and yanking it over her bare chest. Bullets chewed through the thin walls as Wyatt grabbed her arm, hauling her toward the back of the room. He slammed his heavy boot into the frosted glass of the bathroom window, shattering it instantly. "Go!" He shoved her upward. Abby scrambled through the jagged frame, tearing her jeans and slicing her palm on a shard of glass, tumbling out into the dirt alley behind the motel. A second later, Wyatt vaulted through, landing gracefully beside her. "To the bike," he commanded, pulling her to her feet. Wyatt's knucklehead was parked in the shadows near the ice machine. He kicked the heavy engine to life, the roar splitting the quiet Tonopah night like a thunderclap. Abby leapt onto the back pillion, wrapping her arms around his waist with a vice-like grip, burying her face into his scarred back. The motorcycle tore out of the lot, kicking up a violent spray of gravel just as the masked men burst into the alley, raising their weapons. But Wyatt was already shifting gears, hurtling down the pitch-black stretch of Highway 95. They rode for hours, the adrenaline slowly bleeding out of Abby, replaced by the freezing desert wind. Dawn was breaking when Wyatt finally pulled onto a scenic overlook near the California border. The sky bled gold and pink over the jagged mountains. Wyatt killed the engine and swung his leg over the bike, looking exhausted and entirely uncompromising. He reached into his leather cut, pulling out a thick manila envelope and a prepaid burner phone, shoving them into her chest. "Cash, $5 grand, and the phone has one number," Wyatt said, his steel blue eyes devoid of the warmth they had shared. "It's a journalist in Los Angeles investigating Agent Jenkins. Call him. Give him the true story. Clear Declan Sullivan's name." Abby stared at the envelope. "And if I just run?" "If you run, those men will find you," Wyatt replied softly. "Do this, and the feds will have to place you in a new, airtight program. To save their pair, you get a new life, and my father rests in peace." He turned back to his Harley, throwing his leg over the saddle. "Wyatt," she called out, "back at the motel. Was any of it real?" Wyatt paused, the Nevada wind whipping his sandy blonde hair. "We're both ghosts, Leah, and ghosts don't get to have real lives." He kicked the engine over, the roar swallowing her reply, and tore off down the highway. Abby stood alone in the desert dawn. She had survived the Hells Angels twice. Now, she just had to survive the truth. If this gritty tale of betrayal, brotherhood, and survival kept you on the edge of your seat, you won't want to miss what we have coming next. The criminal underworld is full of dark secrets and shattered loyalties, and we are dedicated to bringing you the most intense, realistic stories on the internet. Hit that like button, share this story with your friends who love a thrilling ride, and subscribe to our channel for more pulse-pounding, high-octane narratives every single week. Stay wild and stay safe.